All right. Next slide, please. All right, welcome everyone. I know there's only two of us in here, but we're gonna do this activity real quick. We just want to hear your names, your roles, maybe where you're coming from or what district you're a part of, and then your level of familiarity with using decodable text in literacy lessons. And so you can see there, one being I've heard of them, and five being that I use them all the time with consistent routines. So go ahead and drop that in the chat, or if you feel so comfortable, go ahead and unmute. Either way, we just want to know where everyone's coming from and entering this space with, what knowledge they're entering this space with.
I'll just unmute. My name's
Okay.
Tiffany Spalding. I'm the coordinator of teaching and learning for Campbell Union School District, so a district administrator. And I am a 5, even though I'm not myself using them on a daily basis at this point.
Awesome. I think our person might have just dropped off. So we'll wait for them to come back on. I mean, they can come back on when they're ready. I think we'll keep moving. Thank you, Tiffany, for sharing. Next slide, please. Thank you. So to everyone, whether you're watching us on the recording or you're here with us right now, this workshop is put on by our amazing partners, TNTP, in partnership with Project Arise. If you're not familiar with Project Arise, we offer professional learning opportunities for TK to 12 educators in California, and we're funded through the Reading Instruction and Intervention Grant from the CDE, and we strive to, as you can see here, elevate inclusive and effective literacy instruction for every learner. We do that with a bunch of partners that you see here, our County Office of Education partners. I'm from the Contra Costa County of Education, Glenn County, San Diego, and we also have our content partners. Like I said, TNTP is one of them, and we're super excited that they're facilitating the session tonight or today. Next slide. One other thing we offer is this statewide opportunity available online. There are 5 self-paced courses, and there's different content within those. There's content around executive functioning and literacy. TNTP, amazing partners, as I've said before, have created 3 courses for us. Literacy is equity, foundational skills, comprehension and knowledge building. And then there's also one last course on intensive intervention. These are 100% free to California educators. And also, if you complete them, you're able to apply for some graduate units through the University of the Pacific for a very, very low fee. So lots of really great things in there. Please feel free to check those out. I think, yeah, one more slide. One other thing we offer is some literacy professional learning, such as the one that you're attending right now. We also offer some professional learning this year around literacy screening. As we know, there's a reading difficulties risk screener now in California. So lots of support around that, support around adolescent literacy, and then support for learners with diverse literacy needs, which you're at right now. And we'll also offer some more sessions in the future. And I'm gonna wrap this one up real quick so we can get into what you all came here to hear and engage with. Session resources, our partners at TNTP have created this amazing note catcher / note taker, which we'll put in the chat in a few. Feel free to use that throughout the session to catch any thoughts, answer any questions, note any questions, and then we will make sure that you all have access to this recording and other things after the session is done. Without further ado, I want to pass it to our TNTP partners who are going to tell us all about decodable text and how we can use them with multilingual learners and students with disabilities.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Matt. So yes, the handout link is in the chat. The handout also has links to the slides, as well as some resources, one for your use on your own and one that we'll be using in the session. If you want to be taking notes in the handout, feel free to make a copy of it and take notes there. I think it's view only right now, but if you make a copy, you should be able to edit it. So that was Matt from CCCOE, who just did that whole introduction. Thank you so much. And I'm Rebecca Dreyfus. I'm a director at TNTP, and I'm joined here by Suyapa. if you want to come off mute and say hi, I don't know what people see when we're recording.
Hi, everyone. My name is Siapa Canales. I'm a senior manager here at TNTP. I'm focused on a lot of literacy work through Project Arise, specifically around early learning and multilingual learner supports.
Awesome. And my background is in special education, and I also have been doing a lot of early literacy work using the Arise courses with clients through TNTP. So we have 3 different objectives for today. We have a belief objective, a knowledge objective, and a skill objective. So hopefully by the end of this session, we will have cultivated the belief that all students can learn and are capable of achieving grade level standards with multiple at-bats and timely support and practice. We're hoping that you walk away with the skills, the knowledge to articulate the importance of decodable text for all learners, and be able to articulate what an aligned foundational skills lesson with key practices looks like. And we're hoping you'll be able to walk away with the skill to plan foundational skills lessons aligned to a decodable or in context practice. And we'll have some application and practice time at the end of this session to do just that. So we're going to start with just like a quick overview of literacy and its purpose, norming around what do we mean when we say decodable text. And then really getting into the meat of it. Why do those texts matter? How do you leverage them in the classroom? And then some time to actually practice doing that. And then we will close out. I'll name right now, it's like a lot of content for 75 minutes. So we're hoping that you can continue to use the deck as a resource. If there's anything we're not able to dive into in depth today, you will have access to the slides, and we're hoping that it can be used ongoing for learning and planning. So, when we think about literacy, I think this is something really critical to highlight, specifically when we're talking about the science of reading. A lot of people, when we're talking about literacy now, think specifically about phonics, right? And skills in isolation, learning letter sounds, being able to decode words. When we talk about literacy, it's important to think about the goal of literacy, which is really being able to understand, interpret, create, and communicate in the world, right? Through multiple means. So there's literacy like we think of as reading and writing, there's digital literacy, there's being able to be literate in understanding information. And so as we're thinking about equipping our students to be literate in the world, this is part of why the in-context practice piece around decodable text is so important, in addition to teaching the explicit skills. And so we also talk about the science of reading, big push for science of reading, and some changes in policy around what's expected in terms of literacy instruction. And we know, as has come up in California, that there's sometimes been some tension around, like, when we say science of reading, do we mean all students, right? Do we mean multilingual learners? Do we mean kids who learn differently? Do we mean reading as a whole, or is it just teaching letters and sounds again? So we sometimes see it being interpreted as a sole focus on direct instruction and phonics skills in isolation. And what we really want to highlight in this session and on these next workshops is moving from the science of reading as a foundation and expanding to the science of language and literacy. We're doing science of reading, and we're also thinking about those components of language development and literacy development as a whole. Using these questions really as a guide, who are the individual students that the system is serving? What are their assets and their needs? And how can we adjust our approaches to best serve all of our students while grounding in that evidence base around the science of reading? So it's not throwing out the science of reading. We're using science of reading as a way to meet the needs of all of our learners. So this may be something that you're used to seeing, right, is the reading rope. Something that we're going to be talking about in future sessions around these workshops is this Spanish reading tapestry, which was developed for Spanish-speaking multilingual students, but can be applied across multiple languages. And what you'll notice is it has these same components around word recognition and language comprehension, but it also has these additional strands around cross-linguistic connections and translanguaging. And that's something we're going to be talking about throughout these workshops is how are we building in opportunities for cross-linguistic connections, translanguaging, and metacognitive kind of development around language development while we're teaching foundational skills in our classrooms. I also want to name that while the science of reading describes critical components of learning to read, it does not imply that alternative pathways to reading are invalid. So I am a special education teacher. There are students for whom different ways of reading make most sense and they can still become really proficient readers. So deaf and hard of hearing children, for example, may have limited access to speech phonemes. And so they may focus more on word recognition, fluency, vocabulary, comprehension, right? Those other components of the reading rope and can still be fully capable, proficient readers. Same with non-speaking students who maybe use communication devices, right? They may express their reading mastery differently, rather than through oral reading fluency, for example. But what we're not saying through science of reading is that it's the only way is phonics. What we're saying is phonics is a critical foundational skill in addition to these other components of the rope that when we teach systematically and explicitly through the rope or the tapestry, we're able to develop more complex language and literacy skills for all children. So with all of that as background, really the purpose of this series is to kind of bridge that research and practice for equitable literacy outcomes, specifically when we're talking about students with disabilities and multilingual learners. So I want to give a minute or two for processing time and reflection. You have these questions in your handout. Nicole, I do not think we need to do breakout groups. Thanks for being prepared to do that. So I'd love for you to think about one or all of these questions, either connect, extend, or challenge. So how did this context around literacy and the science of reading, the science of language and literacy, connect to what you already knew? How did it extend or build on what you already knew? Or how did it challenge what you had previously learned? I want to give us a minute here for you to think about any of these questions. And then if someone is willing to put in the chat or come off mute, that would be so wonderful. And if not, we will continue to move.
Yeah, I just dropped it in the chat, but that's something that I'm definitely still learning about is the tapestry. And I really appreciate that there's sort of two models that we can look at. I also wanted to connect back to one of your first slides where you talked about the science of literacy or language and literacy, maybe. Yeah, I really appreciate that reframing.
Thank you so much.
I appreciated you sharing different ways that students, their pathways to literacy, because I think I recently had this conversation with a teacher whose student has kind of bypassed everything that they're working on with phonemic awareness and phonics, and he's reading novels, but he really struggles to do some of what we had considered foundational skills in kindergarten. So I recently had a conversation with a teacher about this. So it was nice kind of validation, hearing different ways that students can show literacy success that isn't necessarily what we think of when we think of like the science of reading and the components involved with learning to read. So
absolutely. Thank you. Yeah, and the science of reading, right, is so important in terms of strong instruction, right, and giving students access and opportunity to become literate. And like, yes, we see students who their pathway is different, and it's important to be cognizant of the end goal of literacy, right? All right. So just a quick norming on what are decodable texts. So technically, right, like all books and text are decodable in that you can read them eventually. But what we're really talking about is decodable texts contain specific grapheme phoneme correspondences, right? Specific spelling sound patterns that students have learned and can practice in context. So these texts provide students with the opportunity to use their developing skills around segmenting and blending, practice reading automatically, and experience independent reading success. And when we're teaching students how to read, we're often teaching them specific phonics patterns, right? And the decodable texts are then the texts that have those patterns in a predictable way. Not necessarily like a repetitive text, things that we maybe have seen in the past, but authentic application of those spelling patterns in context. So why is that important? And why is that important specifically for students with disabilities and multilingual learners? When we're talking about lessons, something we talk about a lot or think about a lot when we're lesson planning is coherence within each lesson. So here's a student, and these little puzzle pieces in their brain represent the different components of a lesson. So let's say this student comes into their classroom, they're doing phonemic awareness practice with CVC words, right? So they're practicing blending things like at, mat as their beginning of their lesson. Then they have a new sound introduction in their lesson, and it's the long U. So they're learning the long U as their phonics pattern. Then they go into some encoding practice. We know it's best practice to have encoding and decoding in the same lesson. And so the teacher plans some encoding practice with high frequency words. And then they're reading a book. And this book has a lot of words with the digraph sh, sh, and the vowel teams ee and ea for the spelling of e. And then we look at this and we step back, we're like, that doesn't really make a lot of sense. But this happens a lot in lessons, right? This happens a lot. We have different pieces that all represent a best practice of foundational skills instruction, but don't end up fitting together. And we'll see the end result is the middle puzzle piece for this child, not super sure what it is that they're learning in reading. So why might it be challenging for the student to acquire literacy this way? That's our kind of reflection question. I won't make you answer it. I'll have you think on it. Now we have another lesson, right? So this time the student walks in to class. They're doing phonemic awareness practice, blending with the long U sound. So words like k, ute, cute. Then they go into their new phonics sound and spelling pattern, which is the long U, spelled with U consonant E. Then they're going to do their encoding practice. And instead of high frequency words this time, their encoding practice is with the same spelling pattern, U consonant E. And then they're going to go into reading a book. They're in context practice, and that one has, again, the U consonant E spelling pattern. So then when we ask this child what they're learning in reading, right, in their reading block, their foundational skills block, they can tell us, oh, well, I learned that U consonant E is a way to spell the long U sound. And now I also know that when I see words with U consonant E, I know what they sound like, right? I can read that word. It has the U sound in it. So there's a difference, right, between this format of lesson and this piece, even though both of them contain all of the components of a strong foundational reading lesson, right? All of them contain phonemic awareness, phonics, out of context practice, encoding, and in context practice. So what we're talking about really is we want throughout the lesson for students to receive multiple at-bats with the practice. The difference between the first and the second lesson was that in the second lesson, the child was getting to see that spelling pattern and read it and write it multiple times in multiple contexts, in and out of context. We also want to be providing them with multiple opportunities in context, so that decodable text throughout the week, for that same reason, to be able to be authentically applying that skill so that they're able to practice it in a real life way, right? It's one thing to be able to read the word on its own. I saw this a lot. I had a lot of kids. You give them the word, they read the word. Once the word's in a sentence, they're like, I've never seen that word in my life. So how are we giving them the opportunity to be applying it in real reading scenarios as well? So high quality practice, which we'll be looking at when we plan our lessons shortly, needs to be sufficient. So early readers need 8 to 12 exposures usually. Readers who maybe learn differently, have a learning disability, might need over 50 times in order to fully map that spelling pattern for themselves. We want it to be varied, and this is something we'll talk about in an additional workshop as well. We have a whole workshop on multisensory instruction, right? But we want multimodal ways for students to be able to solidify those foundational skills. In every lesson, students need to be listening, speaking, reading, and writing. Opportunities to use manipulatives or interactive games, movements, and it needs to be frequent, more frequent than you'd think. Within an activity, one singular activity, students should have 3 to 5 opportunities to respond per minute, right? And so we think about the balance between student work and teacher work, right? Or student talk and teacher talk. That's a really different ratio than I had in my head as a teacher, right? When you think about direct instruction. And so when we're thinking about this high quality practice, giving students access to decodable text where they're engaging independently or with a partner gives them those multiple opportunities to be practicing and responding with each other. So this is all in the context. I'm going to move through this pretty quickly because I feel like we've hit on this, but of the instructional hierarchy. So when we're thinking about skills, we're thinking about the movement from acquisition to fluency to adaptation and generalization, which is that authentic use. And what I'll highlight again is our acquisition phase, we can think of as like when we're learning those phonics skills in isolation, right? Fluency is when we start reading with automaticity. And then the adaptation and generalization is students being able to pick up that decodable book and read those words in context. And so that's really the ultimate goal. So if we shift our thinking when we're planning a lesson from teaching skills in isolation to backwards mapping from the end goal of being able to read authentically in context, that can really shift how we approach lesson planning and instruction to support students who maybe are feeling kind of disconnected in that way that we saw on one of those slides, particularly for multilingual learners and students with disabilities who tend to get pulled out of class to learn something else and then put back in and expected to generalize it in that space. So I'm going to move forward. So as we're thinking about our particular groups of students with disabilities and multilingual learners, we're thinking always about ways to support students' strengths and areas of need, right? So multilingual learners are coming in with strength of already having language, right? Already having a language at least, and sometimes already having literacy in a language, which at that point is a huge leg up. So we're thinking about how are we supporting students in making cross-linguistic connections between their home language and English? How are we leveraging UDL for multiple means of representation, engagement, and expression for students who maybe have strengths in certain areas that don't show up in every lesson structure? How are we providing multiple application and practice opportunities? And then how, like we said before, for the so much practice, right? How are we giving students opportunities to listen, read, write, and speak all 4 of those things in every lesson? So before we move forward, I want a quick pause for processing because that was a lot of information. I want you to think about a student in your class, or if you're a site level or district level team member, a student in your school or a student who you had in a class previously who is or was a multilingual learner or a student with disability. 2 questions, as I know people are coming in here with different levels of experience. So 1, how does your current use of decodable texts support that child in their language and literacy development? Or 2, how might the use of decodable text, if you haven't gotten there yet, support that child in their language and literacy development? So I'll pause for a minute here for reflection, and if anyone has an example or a thought that they'd like to share out loud, that would be awesome.
I appreciate the processing time. I'm actually thinking about students who do get pulled out of class, Rebecca, when you mentioned asking them to like miss portions of the lesson, specifically when we are doing explicit practice, and then asking them to come back into lesson. And then maybe the assessment that we use actually doesn't even follow the systematic approach that we're using in the lesson. And so I'm thinking about the decodable text as those authentic at bats, in that the first time that students are being asked to apply these skills should not be when I am assessing them for a benchmark or for progress monitoring, but rather they should be having as many, as you mentioned, if not way more opportunities to be able to practice this with decodable text, and the opportunity should be created within the lesson for that to happen, especially if they're being asked to miss parts of the lesson.
That's a great point. Yeah, and that brings up the point of even being able to use decodable text as like a formative assessment, right? Of like how much is sticking? Are they able to apply it? What do I need to go back and teach, or what do I need to preview next time? And I'm seeing in the chat opportunities to apply learning from the lesson, choral or echo reading supporting frequent responses. Yes, so the more that students are able to read, write, speak, listen, right? The more that words are coming out of their mouth from the page, the better. Thank you for highlighting that. Okay, so we're gonna get into some of the how, right? Like all of that sounds great. How do I leverage decodable text in my classroom? And this is the part where really like some of these slides will probably be useful to go back to because they're very like visual. And so I can't necessarily, right, like they may take more unpacking than we have here, but I did want to provide a lot of different ways that using decodable text in class can look. So I'm gonna walk us through some example decodable protocols and routines of what does it look like in a day or in a week to teach decodable texts. So first, as was highlighted in the chat, right, decodable routines support both explicit instruction and student practice. So decodable texts don't just mean hand the kid a book and say read it, right? But it also means that we are giving them the opportunity to do that practice on their own, to hold that cognitive load. So when we're introducing a text, right, there's some explicit instruction pieces. We're introducing the text. We're previewing spellings and vocabularies that the students are going to need in order to be able to access that text. We're setting a purpose for the reading, and that can influence which decodable routine we choose to use, right? Depending on what is the goal of this reading today. We may have to do some knowledge building, right? Schema building in terms of supporting comprehension, and we may do some direct teacher modeling, particularly in the lower grades, right? We may model, what does it look like to read a text out loud? How am I going to sound? What am I going to do with my finger? How do I know when it's time to turn the page? What do I do when I see a period versus an exclamation point, right? Like we see a lot of that. And then when students are practicing, they're doing some sort of decodable reading routine. So we have echo reading, choral reading, partner buddy reading, independent reading, a lot of different opportunities to engage. And then they may do some sort of oral or written wrap up, story retelling, questions, discussion at the end, which is again an opportunity for students to be engaging in literacy. Suyapa just dropped in the chat also a resource around different opportunities or different ways to engage with decodables. So feel free also to check that out. It's also linked in our handout. So when we think about reading, right, the purpose of practicing in text is ultimately for students to be able to read independently. That's the ultimate goal. And that doesn't mean that they're reading independently right away or all the time. But what's important to know is that there's some different scaffolds, right? Different levels of support when we're using decodable text. And what we see often is maybe the most support happening with the first read. And then as we reread the same text throughout the week, we release that support so students are reading independently. Or as we get further into the year, and students are more familiar with the decodable routines and how to engage in a text, we see the release happen. Here's another example. I'm going to skip over this one because it's similar content, but a little bit built out differently. So here's one example routine of a multiple reads of a decodable text. So for the first read, before the reading, the teacher may state a purpose or focus of reading the text. They may review the specific skills or vocabulary, right? Phonics pattern vocabulary that they're going to need. Students maybe then will read and reread the text, maybe an echo read in kindergarten, a choral read in K1, or a whisper read in grades 1 and 2. So again, depending on where the class is at, depending on what feels most appropriate. And then the teacher will provide prompts and feedback. This piece is really critical. We often see teachers skipping over the feedback component, and giving kids the opportunity to receive feedback and try again right then is one of the things that makes decodables the most effective, right? And so not just releasing them and having them come back when they're done, but am I circulating? Am I hearing them? Am I saying, oh, like, what was that word? Like, try again, have them try again, and giving them that opportunity for correction. Then we may another day reread that same text, again reviewing vocabulary and the spelling pattern, this time doing a choral read with the goal being fluency, and then having some comprehension questions. And then with additional reads, we may mix up how they do it. Maybe they're buddy reading and they're providing peer feedback this time, right? Again, more opportunities to engage with each other and the text. Maybe they're reading independently this time. Different ways to leverage the text throughout the week without it feeling like they're doing the same thing over and over and over again. Another added component could be around highlighting words with phonics patterns. So this is a kind of way to help students engage with the text. What we do recommend is that the teacher and the students read the text before going through and highlighting first. Then students can work independently or with a peer to highlight the specific skill or pattern and focus, read the highlighted words, reflect on those words, like make sure that they read them correctly, reflecting on, like, does that sound like a word I know? And then reading and rereading the text again, either sentence by sentence or page by page. Now that they have kind of the phonics pattern and focus at the front of their minds, right? And they see it highlighted. Again, it's really important that the teacher be circulating to provide feedback and support here, and that then students are given the opportunity to make meaning. That's another piece that comes up a lot. Decodable texts in some curricula are not always the most exciting to make meaning of. And so there's a balance, right, between making meaning and doing deep comprehension work, particularly as you get into older students whose maybe comprehension abilities and cognitive abilities far outpace their decoding abilities. Does not mean they should only be limited to decodable text, right? Reading ability is not equal to thinking ability. And so that's something really important to know, particularly when we're thinking about students with disabilities and multilingual learners. But it is still important to give them opportunities to make meaning of the decodable text, in addition to giving them content-rich text if those don't happen to be the same thing. So in this deck, I've also provided some different decodable routines over multiple days. So this is an example of a 3-day decodable routine with 2 different decodable texts and what you might plan out for your days based on those. There's also an example of a 5-day decodable routine with 3 different decodable texts. And so again, I'm not going to go into all of these in depth, but I do encourage you, if you're curious about how to apply decodables in a day or in a week or in 3-day blocks, could come back to this and see what resonates in terms of what you're trying to do with your students. What's also important to highlight is that our focus is different in the different grades. Right, so in kindergarten, our biggest focus when we're looking in and out of context practice is accuracy, right? Are we able to decode those words? Yes, we're working on fluency, but often the focus is really around accuracy. Are we able to do that phonics and decoding work, both in and out of context? In first grade, we're still really focused on accuracy, but we start thinking about rate and prosody, and that's where you might start looking at sentences around like, what does the different punctuation mean? How am I going to read it? Playing around with different voices, right? In second grade and 3rd to 5th, we're really working on all of those. In second grade, we see decodable text and grade level authentic text. And as I mentioned just now, in 3rd to 5th, we often don't see decodable texts anymore, right? We see those grade level authentic texts. So what's important there is to be able to see what part of those texts are decodable, right? When we're learning about morphology and we're learning suffixes, prefixes, affixes, root words, right? A lot of those are things that kids can learn to break down, right? And also syllables, right? Decodability looks different, right? It's not just CVC words anymore, but we can still approach grade level authentic text in a decodable way if we're teaching the skills that are aligned to the text in order to read them. So, quick processing time. How do you see these decodable routines fitting into your lessons? Are you already incorporating them into your practice? And if so, how? And if not, what support might you need to do so? And or how do decodable routines support multilingual learners and students with disabilities in language and literacy development? So again, you have these questions in your handout. I would love to give you some processing time on those and then open up the floor for any thoughts before we get into our application. Awesome. Thanks, Tiffany, in the chat. I see the day-to-day breakdowns feeling helpful. That's great. Awesome. Yeah, definitely. Please share with your teachers. That's great. We would love that. All right, so I'm gonna do a super quick rundown of an example lesson for first grade. And again, this is something that maybe is useful to share with teachers. And it's really going back to that idea of the lesson needing to be coherent and aligned to the decodable, with the decodable as the end goal. So this is a book, Decodable, pulled from a lesson from a curriculum I will not name, but it's a curriculum that exists. And this decodable has long O and long U with the vowel consonant E spelling pattern. An example spelling, a lesson objective is here for first graders. I can accurately read words with the long O and long U spelling patterns. So when we're introducing, right, we're doing our phonemic awareness at the beginning of the lesson. This is a really good opportunity to remind students what their mouth feels and looks like when they're creating that long O and long U sound. So some classrooms have these visuals. If you don't, they're pretty easy to find online. And it's an opportunity really for us to practice the O and U sounds, particularly for students maybe who are still learning the phonemes in the language. You can talk to them about their mouth positioning, how their mouth feels. They can look at a partner, they can look in a mirror, and you can practice sorting words orally, right? Like these ones are on here because it's a slide deck. But this would be an opportunity for an oral exercise, right? Where the teacher says, rose, is that O or oo, right? And students say rose has O, right? And you can put it in that category. Spoke, cube, fuse, same idea. This is also an opportunity for us to make some cross-linguistic connections with our students, right? So the long O sound does exist in Spanish. It is spelled differently. But in this opportunity, when we're talking just about phonemic awareness, we may say, Rose spoke. This is the long O sound. Can you think of a word in your home language that has that O sound that sounds like O, right? Or you can provide it. We might hear the word oso, right? In Spanish, that also has that same sound. Notice your mouth is doing the same thing, right? So helping them make that auditory connection. Same with you also exists in Spanish, similar sound, right? And so helping students make those connections between their home language and English. There's a resource linked in the lesson planning template, which we'll use shortly, which allows you to look up different languages and see the transfer connections. And it'll show you whether there's a direct transfer, an approximate transfer, or no transfer for that language. So you do not need to know your students' languages or speak all of them in order to be able to help them make those connections. If you're able to plan a little bit ahead and do some of that thinking of like, oh, this is an approximate, right? It kind of sounds like that, or this sound actually exists in this language as well. So after the phonemic awareness, you might do some word chaining, right? So another way to switch from the oral language to the written language. A chaining exercise could look something like this, right? Where a teacher says, okay, our first word is phone. Now we're going to change the f to b. This can be oral or written. Now we're going to change the b to t, right? Say that word, tone. Okay, now we're going to add stone, right? So if it's a higher grade level and they're able to write out all of these spellings, right? That can be something they do on a whiteboard. It can also be something you're doing on a board with Post-its. It can also be something oral, but you're noticing again, we're using the long O and the long U as that phonemic awareness, phonics, and encoding practice. That's when then you can introduce the text, right? And in the text, we're going to see these same spellings, the long O and the long U. O like rose, U like cube. Again, those are the words that we use in the sort, and also the words that we use in the sort chaining exercise, and also the words that we used in our initial phonemic awareness priming. You can do a quick hit on the essential question if there is one, right? We're not forgetting comprehension altogether. And then we can use some of our tricky words in a sentence to preview vocabulary. Then maybe the students are doing a partner read. We're giving explicit instructions. You're partner A. The student with the shortest hair is partner A. The student on the left is partner A. Partner A is going to read pages 39 and 41. Partner B is reading 38 and 40. They're going to highlight those words with those same spelling patterns that they already saw, that they already practiced 3 times already in 3 different ways. They're going to read those words aloud, and then they're going to read the text to each other. Here's an example of the actual text from this book with modeled highlighting of, okay, I had them use green for the long U sound. I had them use yellow for the long O sound. Partner A is reading this page. Partner B is reading this page. They're reading to each other. They're giving each other feedback. I, as the teacher, am circulating then and also providing feedback on their reading. And then you can provide some sentence frames or some sort of scaffold as needed for the comprehension questions. So in this lesson, they're thinking about things that the old schools had, which connects to the introductory question around what do you predict that old schools had that we don't have, right? And we can provide them with some ways to answer that question. This is a really good opportunity for a turn-in talk, right? Or some way that you make sure that every child is getting to say something and not just the one who raises their hand. So within that, there's also some example literacy blocks for how that whole lesson could look. I'm again not going to talk through all of these, but this is like a zoomed out version of that lesson, right? Of how are we actually using the decodable across the days with the other components of a foundational skills lesson. Here's an example for kindergarten. There's an example for first grade. You'll notice the timing's a little bit different. And here's an example for second grade. The second grade also has RTI. I want to highlight that I like to put RTI or small group instruction before the whole group instruction and not after. The reason I like to do that is because then I'm able to preview what the whole group lesson is going to be, pre-teach the lesson in that small group, and then those children who are in that small group with me are able to fully engage in the whole group lesson. I know it's not always possible with master scheduling, but what I often see is a whole group lesson, and then whoever didn't get the lesson gets pulled out and gets it done again or taught something differently. I like to put the small group first because then we're not giving kids the opportunity to not get the lesson, right? We're teaching them, we're giving them the skills that they need and the additional at-bats that they need in order to feel confident and included in that full group lesson, which then ends up being their second practice. So if you have the opportunity to play around with your structure that way, I really like doing that, and that's here on the second grade foundational skills block lesson. So quick processing time, and then we're gonna have some time to dive into lesson planning. Anything you notice or wonder about the structure of foundational skills blocks built around a decodable text? Or how might this structure support language and literacy development of multilingual learners and students with disabilities, specifically when we're thinking about lesson coherence? These questions are also in your handout. Feel free to take notes on your own or share aloud.
I was just typing something very similar. I appreciated the call out to previewing the lesson during RTI, and I don't think that's currently our practice in our district. So, but I've been hearing more and more of that being a really good strategy to use. So I will start passing that along.
Thank you. Yeah. I mean, it's one of those things like we're always limited by personnel, right? And when people are available and how and all of the structures. But yeah, I think it does end up, like Nicole said, it supports that confidence then going into the full group lesson. All right, so we're gonna give some time for application, and this will be flexible because here we are together. So I'm gonna link in the chat a lesson planning template, or actually Suyapa, if you could link that. It's also in the handout. And the slides really just outline a possible way to approach. So the lesson planning template has a whole week for lessons. You can just focus on one day. You don't have to focus on the whole week, but wanted to give you the opportunity, since our sample kind of like blocks are the whole week, to have kind of a parallel structure there. So the first thing that we recommend doing is choosing an upcoming lesson and identifying a decodable text that aligns to that lesson. A lot of HQIM, high quality instructional materials, come with a decodable text aligned to the lesson. So it may already be there for your access. If it's not, we would recommend that you find a grade level decodable text aligned to that phonics skill or particular phonics standard. Then looking at the text, there's some guiding questions in the lesson planning document as well. One of the things I want to highlight is considering what barriers to access might exist. And what I want to really stamp is that when I'm talking about barriers, I'm not talking about barriers within the student, right? I'm talking about what barriers within the lesson or instruction are keeping the student from accessing that, or might keep the student from accessing that. So these are aligned to UDL, multiple means of engagement, multiple means of representation, and multiple means of action and expression. The student maybe feels like, I'm not sure why I should do this, right? Oftentimes with students with disabilities, particularly, I see this second one where like, it doesn't feel worth the risk, right? And we sometimes say teachers like, oh, well, they're not engaging. Does it feel worth the risk? How do we make it feel worth that risk? And this is an opportunity where leveraging that pre-teaching can be really helpful in minimizing that perceived risk, right? Then we're thinking about multiple means of representation. Does the student know what is being asked of them? What they're supposed to be doing in that text? Was I clear about the focus of the reading? Why we're reading this text? What's the purpose of it? Are they confused by the language, symbols, or structures, right? Do I need to incorporate more opportunities for cross-linguistic connections, right? Or building that schema? For multiple means of action and expression, maybe I'm not sure how to do this or how to show what I'm thinking. I can't express what I'm thinking, right? Is there an opportunity for me to support the student in that way so that I'm making sure that they're able to fully engage with the text? So when you're looking at the decodable text, there's several other guiding questions in the lesson planning template, and this one's at the end of anticipating what might be the sticking points and how do I as a teacher plan for those. So then once you know those barriers or you've identified them, how are you planning to address them? How can you leverage your students' strengths, right? How can I leverage that home language to support with this? How can I leverage the students' interests or what they feel really confident at? Based on my student data, what spellings or patterns do I need to preview in order for students to be able to access the text? I would look back at any assessment data you have, mastery from the last week, things that maybe this text assumes that they have in order to move forward. What vocabulary or background knowledge needs to be previewed? And then again, what is the purpose for reading this? And the purpose may change from day to day, like we have laid out in the weekly structure. Then once you know that, you can kind of choose what decodable routine you want to use, right? That's going to be dependent on the purpose. It's going to be dependent on how many times you've read it. It's going to be dependent on what barriers you anticipate. It's going to be dependent on which day of the week it is, maybe. Or if you're really bored of one kind of reading and just like want to mix it up, because teachers get bored of stuff too, right? So you can do that. That's allowed. And then once you've determined your decodable text and you've planned for the instruction and practice of the decodable text, this is when we recommend that you backwards plan the rest of your lesson. Using that decodable text, how do I pull out the high frequency words they're going to know? And that becomes our high frequency word practice. How do I pull out the spelling pattern we're working on? And that's going to become their phonics and encoding practice. Those same sounds are then going to be what I use to plan my phonemic awareness practice. And that's how we get that coherent lesson where the student is hearing and writing and reading the same thing in different ways throughout the entire lesson, rather than pulling different bits and pieces for the sake of skill, right? What we want is skill attached to something meaningful. So before we close in feedback, I am gonna just quick go through the template. And if you are in this live and want some time to engage with it now, you're welcome to, but we will take a vote of one person currently. This is the lesson planning template. So step one, you'll notice, is reviewing the decodable text. So what do students need to know and be able to do? What potential misconceptions or barriers might come up? And what do you need to be thinking about in terms of spelling patterns, language supports, irregular words? What strategies will you use to address those? So that's really the first part, just looking at the decodable text. And then you can think about what routines will you use. This is where we have this extra document utilizing decodables in HQIM, which you have access to. Gives you some different ways to engage with decodable texts, what it might look like, and some other kind of tips. So you can use that if this is kind of your first time or you want to just try something new. Then there's the opportunity to then start mapping out the rest of your lesson. So in day 1, what's the priority skill then? What is my phonemic awareness and phonics going to look like? What is the out of context practice going to look like? And then bringing back the decodable, what did I identify as the routine? What am I going to do to teach that? The last step then is thinking about how will we ensure that we're monitoring throughout the lesson in order to support students, right? What does that in the moment feedback look like? What do checks for understanding look like? Again, this is something you can use to map out a single day or map out the week, using the same decodable or different decodables depending on your curriculum and what feels best for your students. So I'm going to pause now to see if we want a few minutes to try that out or if we want to move to closing. So if you are watching this live, pause there and take a few minutes to try to work through that document. Again, if you have a lesson planning document that they're already working with, right? A lot of schools or districts, particularly charter networks, provide lesson planning structures. So these steps are really structure agnostic, right? Like these are steps you can follow as your lesson planning, regardless of the template that you use. We just also wanted to provide a template for those who maybe don't have one and wanted to try using one. So with that, we have a feedback survey that we would love for you to take. If you could share your feedback, it will help us inform also the structure of our upcoming workshops. We do have, as Matt shared, 3 more workshops in this series around serving students with disabilities and multilingual learners in literacy. And Matt, I will pass it to you for any closing remarks. Thank you so much for your engagement today.
Yeah. All right, yeah, thank you so much. First of all, thank you to our partners at TNTP. Thank you, Rebecca, for your excellent facilitation today. I learned so much about using decodable text to support so many different needs of our learners in our classroom. So thank you so much for that. To close this out, right, we from Project Arise also want to thank you for either being here or watching this recording and for all the things you do in your classroom to support literacy. Quick plug, right? We have transitioned to a new social media account. So if you're a teacher, a family member, a district leader, an administrator, please follow CCCOE Lit Project. You'll find parent resources, teacher toolkits, updates about our projects, all these really cool things. And I think with that, again, just thank you to TNTP, and I think we're done for the night. Anyone else have anything to add? All right. Good night. Have a great evening.